千里之行，始于足下。A journey of 1,000 miles begins beneath the feet. We now gather in the Tao to travel the journey together. Welcome to Tao Talks with Derek Lin, where we take a deep dive into the Tao Te Ching by Lao Tzu. I would like to extend a warm welcome to everybody. Thank you for joining us. I want to invite you to center your thoughts and direct your attention to this moment, to the here and now, to be fully present and mindfully aware as we all gather together in this sacred Tao process. As we saw previously, there is a chapter title for 57, 治国章, Rule the Kingdom. So, as it is with the other chapters, the chapter title has two characters. First character to the left means to rule or govern. The character in the middle, as you can see in the slide, that's the character for country, nation, a sovereign state. And then the last character to the right, that's just the character for chapter. So you can call it Rule the Kingdom, and if you prefer, you can consider the title to be Govern the Nation or Govern the Country. Either way, however you prefer to translate the chapter title, the idea is to take charge of your life. The kingdom, country, nation, empire, these are just metaphors for your world. The country, the kingdom, that is your life. You are the sovereign ruler of that, and therefore you need to take charge. You need to take the reins and be in control. That's what it means to be truly sovereign. And as we talk about the meaning of the lines today, please keep that in mind, and you will see it reflected in many of the passages. Let's take a quick recap into the sectional analysis that we did. We looked at the repeating characters. We saw 3 repeating lines with repeating characters in the first position. As you can see, lines 1, 2, and 3 form a section. Then, not as obvious, the second section goes to line 4 all the way down to 13. These are talking about what not to do. Then, from 14 down to 18, the final section, that would be what to do. So we got to line 2 previously. We're about to get into section 2 and possibly into the final section as well. Before we get into that, I want to ask everyone to look at this chapter visually and then imagine the yin and yang symbol. So the complementary duality, always the two halves, describe the setup of this particular chapter as well. We're going to start talking about, as I mentioned, what not to do. What not to do for the ruler in ruling a kingdom, what not to do in one's own life when you rule your life. And in the final section, what to do. So the two halves are the complementary duality in the yin and yang symbol. So to continue with the recap, we talked about the first 2 lines last time, starting out with govern a country with upright integrity. So with all of these lines, we need to consider them in 2 different perspectives. at the scale of the kingdom, at the level of the kingdom, this is basically saying that the ruler should rule with integrity. And we talked about how this meant being open, transparent, etc. It meant acting in accordance with the Tao. No deception, no hiding the truth, apply the law fairly, evenly, enact justice. Now, what about at the personal level? Yes, we can all see that one should live one's own life with integrity. So that means also no deception, no hiding the truth, in the context of being honest with yourself. This is something that cannot be imposed externally upon you. It must come from within. That integrity must come from within, and then it can go from the inside out. Now, back to ruling the kingdom for a moment, I want to mention that traditionally within the Tao, the authentic Tao tradition, there's always multiple levels, even before you get to self-cultivation. In the Tao, it is recognized that you have to start out with yourself before you can even think about affecting other people. You must, as I like to say, get your own ducks in a row. And once you have it all together, naturally people will notice, pay attention, and they will come to you of their own accord to ask you to help them with advice, with suggestions on how to straighten things out for them. So this chapter is a lot about that as well. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Let me back up one step and recap the different levels that we discussed before. So as you may recall, when we talk about cultivating oneself in the context of this chapter, it's about controlling, governing, managing yourself in a skillful way in accordance with the Tao. So that's actually the first level in the three-tier scheme that you see here. It is only after you have yourself under control, well managed, well organized, that you can begin to think about the family, that your ability to govern yourself can extend to good governance in the family. That is, foster harmony with your loved ones. Then it is only after your family is able to act as one unit, united front, that you can begin to spread outward. And typically at this point in the Tao Te Ching, there's also discussion about the community, that you can then affect your neighbors, your friends outside the family. Here though, in a Confucian scheme, the next step would be more general, governing the country. And during the Warring States period, it was important for students of the Tao, including students of Confucius, to go about the war-torn ancient China, hoping to influence the rulers, the warlords, to utilize the Tao to finally attain peace throughout ancient China. It was very important back in those days. And I would argue, still very important today. We can utilize the Tao to bring peace to our inner mental landscape, as well as the family, as well as the community, and perhaps one day the world. Now, in all of these different levels of cultivation or self-governance, there are obstacles. There are things that get in the way. So I wanted to also, last time, bring up the three poisons. They can impose those obstacles at every level of governance. And the three poisons, as you can see, we discussed greed, anger, and ignorance. So these come from the Buddhist tradition, and these are applicable, whether you are talking about yourself, your interaction with others. Greed can come up when you are so eager to acquire material resources. But that very eagerness is what will sabotage you. So in your attempt to depart from the state of being impoverished, you can ironically actually get close to it. At the level of the country, too much greed, which is expressed as excessive desires in this chapter, can lead to negative consequences for the kingdom or the nation, up to and including the depletion of resources, the weakening of the empire, etc. So the other poisons are just as important. We are no stranger to the poison of anger. That includes rage, fury, hatred, loss of control, rationality, loss of harmony in your interactions with loved ones, with friends, with other people. This is all getting to be dysfunctional and abusive as you embark on actions and words that are ill-advised, ill-conceived, and this can mean very negative consequences for the self. At the national level, it can also mean very negative consequences for the country as a whole. In ancient China, in particular, if an emperor was embarking on an ill-advised venture to expand the borders of the empire, especially when resources were already depleted, that usually was a sign that the fall of the empire, the disintegration, the decline of the empire was about to begin. And I think we can all learn from that in running our personal empire. And lastly, delusions, ignorance, confusion. At the personal level, it's wrong ideas, it's conspiracy theories, it's misconceptions, and doing things in not quite the best way and getting not quite the best results. This can manifest in many different areas of life. At the country level, it would be bad policies that cause greater hardship on the people, that diminish the national presence on the world stage, and the list goes on. So these were the different levels and the poisons that we talked about last time, and that was just a brief recap. So let's continue on. We also talked about line 2 previously, and line 2 was the complement of line 1. Line 1 said to govern a country with upright integrity, but then line 2, when using the military, you must do so with surprise tactics, unexpected tactics, creative tactics. You extend that to life and you see that it's all about creativity. So the reason that we talked about for a ruler to deploy the military with surprise tactics, quite simple, because a head-on collision, a confrontation, a direct clash with another country was the most expensive of all, the most costly in terms of resources and lives. It would be like a battle of attrition where many people die or become injured. Surprise tactics, creative approach to attacking and defending are meant to achieve more by using less costly, less loss of lives. In the personal sense, attacking, conflicts, this would be basically about interpersonal contention. the military becomes a symbol for contention in life, like arguments, competitive clashes with other people. And the surprise tactics is basically what most people don't know or won't do. And we're talking about the Tao-centric tactics of, for instance, being the bigger person to apologize first, be the person to bring peace, using virtue, using forgiveness, using harmony to solve problems. And to be creative about resolving these personal conflicts with other people, one thing to keep in mind is that there are always multiple ways to solve a particular problem. So from our younger days, we might have resorted to a forceful, aggressive approach. As we get older, though, hopefully we can look back and realize that, well, I didn't actually have to try to solve the problem that way. Gunship diplomacy. I could have done it in a much more harmonious way and create a win-win situation. And then lastly, we talked about maintaining an open mind for a different approach. And my comment from last time was that oftentimes it is the closed-mindedness that would defeat us even before we begin. Like, oh, it's not possible. It's too difficult. I can't do it. So the better way, the open mind, will be asking questions like, what if? How about this? How about that? So that is the quick recap for what we talked about previously. And I think now we're ready to delve into new material, starting with line 3. As you can see in this slide, line 3 says, take the world with non-interference. So non-interference in this context, it is not about upright integrity. It is not about surprise tactics. It's something else. Let's explore. We're going to start with the last 3 characters from line 3, 取天下. So this is translated as take the world. So grammatically in English, you have to do that in front. In this particular sentence construction, the first 3 characters is use non-interference. So you can flip it the other way in translation. You can say, use non-interference to take the world. That would also be correct. In this particular case, I've chosen take the world with non-interference. Really mean the same thing. Let's talk about what this signifies, the meaning behind this, at both the kingdom level as well as the personal level. Starting with the kingdom level, to take the world means the kingdom expands and becomes a powerful empire. So when the kingdom prospers, when the kingdom becomes strong and powerful, it has the ability to expand its borders to become even larger than before. This was certainly the aspiration of the ancient kings. They all wanted to become the emperor that ruled over all of China. Now, what about the personal level? When we say take the world, what it means is living up to your potential. What it means is that for most of us, we are using our true capabilities in a woefully limited fashion. We are not living up by a long shot to what we can truly do in life. If you are able to realize even a fraction of that potential, you can be expanding as a human being into all different new areas, new experiences, new learning. So take the world would be like winning the world, your world. So then what about non-interference? So starting at the kingdom level, here's the idea. This is an old concept. A nation is like a living thing. A living thing has a natural vitality. And one of the examples that was used in ancient times was to compare a nation to a living thing like a horse. That living thing, with its natural vitality, is able to develop, strengthen, grow. All you really have to do with that living thing is to remove the things that are harmful to it, remove the things that limit or constrain it, to let it develop naturally by itself. That natural vitality will express itself as power and strength. And it's all progressing in a perfectly natural way. So using that idea, applying that to a nation, it means that you do away with the things that are limiting or harmful to the growth of the country or the kingdom. What about at the personal level? So we all have to talk about each one of these lines in those two different scales. So you can use that concept for yourself. You can also think about your world, your country, your empire, the empire that is your life. You can think of that as having a mind of its own, a life of its own. It's got a natural vitality to it. You have a natural vitality. So all you really have to do to make sure that you grow strong and powerful is that you must take care of the basics. You must do away with complexity, leaving only a framework that is simple and easy to follow, a system that works well for you. Just using exercise as an example, you wouldn't do anyone any good to set up a very complex routine that's hard to follow, because chances are you do it for a while and then you miss a day and then the discipline evaporates. If you keep it simple, you can do it consistently for a long time, thus extracting the benefits and progress, grow, strengthen naturally. So the idea is simplicity. So what you have to do, once you set up that system that works well for you, stop messing with it, stop interfering with it, stop fixing something that's not broken. You take a step back and you allow everything to function and develop naturally, including yourself. Therefore, no interference in this context, all it means is not persist in trying to fix things, especially things that are already working quite well. And the reason for that is because the natural improvements, they only happen when you are not constantly interrupted by yourself. So the non-interference is you getting out of your own way. That's what it's trying to say. So then after this line, Lao Tzu is asking himself a question. Lao Tzu says, how do I know this is so? How do I know this is right? How do I know this is the correct way? So let me talk about this line a little bit. It looks kind of long. So line 4, I want to break it down literally for you. So there are 7 characters, as you can see. So I want to break them down for you one by one. The first character is the ancient form of I. Then we have the character for what, and sometimes it can be how. And then we have the character for with. Then in the middle, we have the character for know, to know something. And then it. Then we have a character for so, as in this is so. This is, it means yes, it means so, it means right. then the last character is not translated into any English word. It's a sentence-ending character in classical Chinese, and its only purpose is to serve as a punctuation mark, what we know as a punctuation mark, and that is the question mark. So if you string this together, it doesn't make sense. What with, no, it, so, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. What it really means is, with what do I know it is so? That's the rough translation. And you can see that what I chose eventually was, how do I know this is so? So this is reasonably close to the original to still be a very literal translation, but then it reads a little bit better in English. So let me focus for just a moment on the first character there. Wu. Pinyin, W, pretty easy. This is frequently utilized in ancient or classical Chinese. It is the formal first person pronoun, me, myself, and I. So we know that this is Lao Tzu referring to himself. How do I know this is so? How does Lao Tzu himself know that what he's expressing in this chapter is correct? Then the next line says, with the following. So let's explore that a little bit. This is the transition to the sort of the main part of this chapter today. Line 5, literally 2 characters, literally with this, eats. That's it, very simple line. In this context, it is the intro for the lines below. So with the following, with the lines below is what it says. So now you can put these 2 lines together, line 4 and line 5, and you can also reflect back on lines 1, 2, and 3, and you can see the flow in the beginning part of this chapter, chapter 57. Here's how the flow goes. Lao Tzu points out the best way to rule the kingdom, upright integrity is what he says. Then the best way to use the military, so creativity, surprise tactics, unexpected tactics, ingenuity is what he's talking about, and the best way to let the kingdom grow. You start out as a kingdom, perhaps you can grow into a powerful empire. So he's pointing out the best ways to do the 3 different things: to rule, to fight, and to grow. Then, with line 4, he's asking the question, well, how do I know these are the best ways? Then, with line 5, he's saying, with the following, and transition to, it's a segue into the next section that talks about, observing all the things that are done wrong. These are the things that I don't want to do, okay? He starts out with a negative and then ends with a positive. So let's explore the next section. There's a lot of ideas, concepts there that I think will be very useful, very valuable to all of us. So line 6 starts out with the observations from Lao Tzu on what doesn't work, or what gets a bad result, what gets negative results. So Lao Tzu says in line 6, when there are many restrictions in the world, let's talk about that for just a moment. So let me break it down in 3 parts. So sometimes we have compound characters in Mandarin, in Chinese, that the 2 characters together form one idea. So 天下, the first one, it literally means below heaven, and what it means is the world, like everything below heaven, everything below the sky. That's the world. The middle character is more or many, much, and then the last 2 characters, restrictions. Let me kind of zoom in on that. Those 2 last characters that you see there, restrictions in the context of forbidden, restricted actions and words. Now let me talk about what that means at the kingdom level. So when you have the ruler, the kings, the emperors, restrictions in the world means restrictions that they impose as a tyrant. So when the world, the country, the kingdom, is under tyrannical rule with many restrictions, things that people cannot do, restricted actions, and also words, expressions, opinions that are critical of the ruling class, those will be restricted. Those will be monitored. So opinions opposed to the government are monitored. So in modern times, we know what that is. We see it elsewhere in the world. We see attempts in our own countries to follow this particular path. We would describe it as totalitarianism. Many other names for that: dictatorship, authoritarianism, fascism. Whether in ancient times or modern times, what we have seen, just like Lao Tzu has observed, what we have always seen time and time again was that historically, heavy-handed rule has always worked out badly for the people, for the rulers, for everyone. So this is basically a cautionary note from Lao Tzu. This is what I have observed. This doesn't work. This produces a negative result. So we're going to want to be extra careful in applying that to life to understand exactly what Lao Tzu is trying to communicate with us. So at the national level, at the level of the country or kingdom, restrictions can apply to restrictive laws, regulations, and rules. So let me just quickly explain what I mean by these three different terms that all seem to be talking about the same thing. Laws, we know what that is, the laws of the land. Regulations are different from the laws in that regulations are usually created by government agencies as a way to enforce the laws. So more specific, more relevant to the work of the agency. Rules can be formal or informal. They can incorporate social customs, norms, etc. So when you have restrictions or restrictive laws, regulations, and rules in any of those categories, you begin to suffer an oppressive, stifling environment. So this is one restriction, one aspect of restrictions. Another aspect is what people are allowed to express. We have seen many times around the world and also in history that whenever you have the oppressive environment, people are allowed to praise the ruling class, but not express dissent. So what they are allowed to express can vary greatly from one country to the next. Lastly, we're talking about taxation, what people are allowed to keep after taxes. So there are multiple facets to taxation. The tax rate may be high or low. The services provided, funded by the taxes, can be good or insufficient. For now, just keep in mind that when we talk about restrictions at the national level, it can apply to all of these different aspects. Generally speaking, it is very possible for the government to be intrusive into people's lives. Just as true in ancient China as it is in the modern world. So the more you increase or strengthen the restrictive rules, laws, etc., the more you tax, the more you restrict people from expressing themselves, the more intrusive everything becomes. Okay, so that, I think we have a good picture on what that looks like at the national level. And Lao Tzu, in that context, is basically providing advice to the ruler that this is what you never want to do. Now, let's advance into the more important stuff. We're all here not to talk about ancient history, not to talk about the fate of countries and empires throughout the entire world, throughout human history. We're not here for that. We're here to talk about our lives. So it's extremely important for us to apply this concept to the individual, to you and me. At the personal level, what do the restrictions mean? So here, I want to ask you to take a step back and keep in mind that you are the ruler of your own life. You are the ruler of yourself. So when we talk about the ruling class imposing restrictions, applying that to the personal level, I think you can see the logic when I say I'm talking about restrictions you have placed on yourself. Restrictions, constraints, limitations that are self-imposed. Now, at first glance, you might say, well, I don't do that. I don't limit myself. Let me observe that oftentimes people do limit themselves with self-imposed constraining beliefs. I can't do that. I can't do that because I don't know how to do that. I don't have that expertise. I'm not smart enough. I'm not educated enough. I'm not that good. That's not for me. I can't. Okay, well, as with everything else in life, I can see that there may be truth in that statement, but not always. I can also see that there are many times when this particular self-limiting statement is made in defeat, even before you start. That is actually not true. So what are some other constraints and beliefs? Well, there's also dogma, dogmatic, inflexible beliefs. So those are the two big areas that restrictions mean for the personal level: self-imposed limitations and dogmatic beliefs. And it's very important for us to recognize that self-limiting, self-imposed limitations, not the same thing as self-discipline. Okay, I'll return to that in just a moment. For now, though, I want to talk about dogma for just a little bit. When you talk about dogmatic beliefs, these are the unexamined, inflexible articles of faith that are rarely checked against reality. So dogma can take many forms in many different areas of life. When we apply dogmatic beliefs to people, to other people, they take the form of prejudice and bias. So that's the most easily recognized way to zero in on dogma. Example, a certain group of people, and you can divide up people by gender, by ethnicity, national origin, religious background, what have you. Certain group of people doesn't have what it takes to do XYZ. That they may be described as unfit for success, unfit for independence. They are incapable of management, leadership, science, technology, engineering, etc. So these are the dogmatic beliefs. Just an example of that. You can apply to areas that's not people-oriented, but this is the easiest way to see it. So as I mentioned, very different from self-discipline. Remember, self-discipline is something that you put on yourself, done for the purpose of improving an aspect of yourself. whereas self-imposed limitations is more like tying yourself up with ropes. And speaking of ropes, that brings me to a story that I would like to share with everyone. It's a story from the Zen tradition. Zen Buddhism has teachings specifically addressing constraints, restrictions, especially as it applies to the material world. In order to be free or liberated from these restrictions, that would be called a spiritual release. So let me share a story with you about that topic. So the story is called the Dharma of Spiritual Release. And this is a story about Zen Buddhism. What is the relationship between Zen Buddhism and the Tao? Well, some of you already know that if you were to combine the ideas from Buddhism with the concepts from the Tao, what you get is a fusion that oftentimes is identified as Zen Buddhism. And it's important for me to also let everyone know that for the ancient Chinese, their concept was not that all the different schools of thought are in opposition with one another. Rather, the Eastern mode of thought was that you can take the best of all these different worlds. You can combine them in creative ways to create something stronger, better. And therefore, when they see Buddhism, when they see the Tao, it was natural for them to combine, to seek common ground, and to come up with something that is a fusion that's better than each individual component. Same thing with Confucian teachings. All these different schools, they reasoned, were schools of thought, of wisdom. Therefore, they have common ground. It is only much, much later on in the West, in the modern world, where the thinking is not inclusive, the thinking is not integration, but good versus evil. And therefore, for some people, somehow Confucian teachings becomes the evil, the dark half, and Tao, those are the good guys. So I'm here to tell everyone, if you were to encounter that, that's completely false. That's not the way it works. Now let's return to Zen Buddhism. In the tradition of Zen Buddhism, there's been a number of distinguished spiritual leaders known as patriarchs. The term patriarch is a misnomer because there's no particular requirement for the leader to have one gender or the other. Patriarch is a male term, but that's a limitation that we have with language and translation. So I want to point to the slide, and if you look at the name of this figure to the left, you might say Senkan. No, Sentai. The pronunciation can be a little tricky due to problems with the pinyin system, but it's not can. It's pronounced Ca. So the third patriarch of the Zen Buddhist tradition was a well-known master. However, this story is not about him. It's about someone who came after. It's about this young man who went by Dao Xin. So a different person. And let me also emphasize that these are historical figures. These are the people that actually walked the earth, a lot of documentation for their historical existence. Dao Xin was born in 580 AD, passed away at the age of 71. Dao Xin, the person to the right, started with Buddhist teachings very young. He started at the age of 7. He studied it for 7 years, and when he was age 14, and we're talking about roughly a little bit more than 1400 years ago, when he was at the age of 14, he met the third patriarch of Zen Buddhism. Now, of course, the patriarch was a big deal. So immediately, Dao Xin went to the master. He said, "Master, please teach me." He begged the master to teach him. He said, "Out of great compassion, please teach me the Dharma of spiritual release. I want this Dharma for spiritual liberation so that I may be released." So the third patriarch looked at this young man, only 14. He asked this question. He said, "Is there someone who has tied you up with ropes?" And Dao Xin was puzzled. What? Where is the master going with this line of question? This was unexpected. Hence, he was momentarily puzzled. He said, "Master, there's no one. There's no one who has tied me up with ropes." He's thinking, what does this have to do with anything? What does this have to do with my request for the master to teach me the Dharma of spiritual release? So then the third patriarch said, "Well, if there's no one tying you up, then why are you seeking to be released?" These simple words shocked Dao Xin to the core. Dao Xin was highly intelligent, so he instantly understood the deeper meaning behind the words of the third patriarch. Now, at the surface level, these words seem to be about a physical situation, about being tied up with ropes. But Dao Xin understood immediately that the master meant to convey the spiritual reality that applied to everyone, including himself. He became enlightened, and later he became the fourth patriarch. We're going to dig into his realization. What did he realize that day that eventually took him on the path of becoming the next spiritual leader, relaying the torch from the third patriarch? Let's talk about that realization. So first of all, the key to the realization was about self-nature. Self-nature is the term in Zen Buddhism that points to the true self, the soul, if you prefer. It is the nature that you've always had and will always have. It is the immutable, unchangeable self-nature that is the you, that ineffable you. No matter what you change about yourself, your self-nature will remain pure and original. So this is really about that. Dao Xin knew that self-nature was originally never constrained by anything. See, to say that you are limiting the self-nature that would be similar to say, well, I'm tying up your soul with ropes, with physical ropes. That's not really possible. So, bottom line, you are never truly restricted by anything. What do we think that? What do we think that we are? What do we seek? As Doesnt did, the Dharma of spiritual release. Well, it is because of the illusions of the material world. They can be misleading. We're confused by these illusions, so we imagine ourselves to be constrained, limited, tied up by external factors. External factors can be someone or something. Someone can be, oh, I'm limited by my coworker, or I'm limited by my manager, my boss. Well, in reality, we're limited only by ourselves. Something can be circumstances or a situation. Well, that is an illusion too. We're really just limited by self-imposed restrictions. Therefore, the bottom line, it is not anyone or anything that has imposed restrictions. When you go to a deeper level with yourself, you quickly realize that at some point, at some deep level, we ourselves have accepted these self-imposed restrictions. That's what makes us impoverished in terms of our life. When we limit ourselves, we don't even try. Therefore, our lives become more impoverished, exactly as Lao Tzu is trying to say. Now, Lao Tzu is also trying to say that because we were the ones who made that acceptance, we also have the power to revoke that acceptance. When you revoke a blind acceptance to limit or restrict yourself, you have the Dharma of spiritual release. All it takes is the realization, hey, there's nobody that's tying me down with ropes. Why did I decide to tie myself up in these artificial restrictions? It doesn't make any sense. So in this part of the Tao Te Ching, now I think you can see these lines and have a completely different feeling. When there are many restrictions in the world, the people become more impoverished. Turn that around. Think about this. When you impose many restrictions on yourself, your life becomes more impoverished. So Doesnt called it the Dharma of spiritual release. If you prefer, you can call it the Tao of spiritual release. Either way, it's liberation and freedom. So now we've gone a little bit past the halfway point in our meeting. I am going to leave the presentation on this slide. I'm going to park it right here while we all take a 5-minute break. I think this is a good slide with which to do some reflection and contemplation. We are now on line 7. So line 7 says the people become more impoverished. So I want to be very specific about the ways of being impoverished. So first of all, more bureaucratic restrictions leads to more burdens on the people. This is, of course, us keeping to the kingdom level in this discussion. Then the other aspect is more taxation leading to the poorer people become. The more you tax, the less they have. And then, because of both of the above, people lose faith in the ruler. The ruler doesn't seem to know what the best way is in governing the country. And because of that, the ruler loses the support of the people. There may be superficial praise, expressions of love and admiration, but in reality, the people and the ruler have gone separate ways. Then we note that historically, this has been rather common. This has been the precursor, the sign of the empire falling or disintegrating. So this has always been the case. Then let's move forward a little bit. You know we have to talk about the personal aspect. Let's apply this to the individual level, and I do definitely regard this as the more important side of the discussion because this is the part that will affect us, that will help us transform, change our lives. So applying this concept to the individual, what do we mean when we say impoverished? To be poor. So I mentioned that take the world means to live up to your potential. To be impoverished is the opposite of that. To not live up to your potential means a couple of things. That, for instance, you always live within your comfort zone. You never venture beyond. And therefore, there's no possibility of learning or exploring. And I would also suggest to everyone that we human beings are truly happy, truly joyous when we grow and learn. Think about in the past when that happened to you. Think about the joy that you experienced in learning something new. That is true happiness. So then another aspect of being impoverished is about mental limitations. That is, limiting your mind with inflexible beliefs. The negative consequence is that you never learn anything new, you never expand your horizons, your perspective remains narrow. So your life is poor because you never make the attempt to push the envelope. You miss the opportunity to experience the exhilaration, what that is like when you go beyond what you thought you could do. So this self-restriction, let me emphasize once again, very different from the concept of self-discipline. When you have self-discipline, it's actually the opposite in that you want to discipline yourself to become better so you can overcome what you thought was your limitation. Now, I can summarize everything we're talking about here with a couple of different charts that I think will make it a little bit easier to visualize. Starting with the kingdom level, ruling the kingdom. So remember, this is what Lao Tzu says as what not to do. More restrictions, more taxations. These are the bad things. These are the bad practice. When you have more restrictions, it leads to people that toil under greater burdens. And when you have more taxations, heavier tax, more different varieties of tax, more frequently, more aspects of life, greater taxation means people get to keep less for themselves. So that is the kingdom level. Of course, as I said, the more important aspect is the personal level. So let's talk about the other part. Not ruling the kingdom for the ancient ruler, but ruling your life in the here and now. So those negative practices become self-imposed limits and dogmatic beliefs. With your self-imposed restrictions, well, you never try, so you never fail. That's the comfortable part, but then you never succeed. So I know that many of you have heard this expression. This is from Wayne Gretzky, one of the great athletes. Wayne Gretzky said, "You miss 100% of the shots you don't take." That's very true. You never try, you won't fail, but you will also not succeed. So in this way, this is how your life can be impoverished. What about dogmatic beliefs? We talked about prejudice, bias. Well, you know, your view of the world, other people, different cultures, etc., remains narrow. It remains very small, whereas the world is very big. So with these graphs, I hope to convey the idea in a way that is easy to visualize, easy to grasp. Now I think we're ready to move on to the next line. When people have many sharp weapons, and now that you have seen us analyze these lines, you can kind of figure out the overall way that we're going to be analyzing the following lines as well. So let's start out with a breakdown of the four characters. The first character in this line means people, the subjects of a kingdom, the citizens of the empire, etc. People. Then the next character, the second character, means more, many, much. And then the third character means sharp. Last character means weapons. Now, it can also mean tools or instruments, but a sharp tool is used as a weapon. So in ancient times, what are we talking about? Well, swords and knives. In modern times, this, can apply to guns as well. So sharp weapons would be just, deadly weapons, weapons that can injure or kill. Now, that's the larger level, the level of society, kingdom, the world, etc., as it applies to rulers. So what about the personal level? What I said is the more important level. Well, these are interpersonal weapons like verbal attacks, verbal weapons, scolding, blaming, accusing. You've seen it. You know what that is like. People wield that as a weapon for the quote-unquote tongue lashing. There's the complaining, condemning, criticizing, the 3 C's. These are all verbal weapons. So the more of these weapons you have, the more negative things become. The way that Lao Tzu expressed it is line 9, when the country becomes more chaotic. Let's explore that. So regardless of time period, whether ancient times or modern times, or scope, regardless of scope, whether for the king, the emperor, or just you and me, this general principle applies. And the principle is, the more weapons there are, the more chaotic it will be. And greater chaos means people get hurt. People are harmed. When we were just talking about verbal weapons at the level of interpersonal contention, Heated discussion can turn into all-out argument. You know, you start out discussing something, before you know it, it's a screaming match. And moreover, at a larger level, disputes can turn into bloodbath when the weapons come out, when the knives come out. Fistfights turn into shootouts. At the national level, a national disagreement can turn into war, battles. So I want to point out one thing. The harm that you do at the personal level, if you think about, you know, in the past, when you have seen people do the mutual accusations, the mutual finger pointing, you've seen friendship broken beyond repair. That's the harm that it can do. At the societal level, at the level of society and countries, definitely we're seeing right now that society itself becomes ever more chaotic with the almost, you know, the amazing, incredible daily shootings, the mass shootings that we see. This, I want to point out this one thing. This is a departure from the idea that you may have heard previously, the idea that an armed society is a polite society. On the face of it, it seems to make sense. When everybody's armed, everybody is super polite. Idea similar to that would be things like, the only thing that will stop a bad guy with a weapon is a good guy with a weapon. So these are, of course, all in favor of the society itself being armed, because then you will have polite society. We've seen that's not true. We've seen that doesn't work. We've seen that Lao Tzu is right in what he expresses here. Those ideas that we have heard before sounded okay. They seem to make sense. They just don't pass the test of reality. They're not wisdom. So moving on. Next, Lao Tzu talks about clever tricks. When people have many clever tricks, well, what does that mean? Let's back up one step. Having more weapons leads to chaos. Having tricks, not a good thing. Clever tricks seems like it may be a positive thing, but actually Lao Tzu is meaning to express a very negative thing, like shrewdness, shortcuts. And that kind of shrewdness can apply in different scenarios. We talked about society can become oppressive, totalitarian. The more oppressive society becomes, the more people are going to try to use clever tricks to evade control. Now, remember, clever tricks are always rooted in some kind of deception. In the material world, in our world, people use clever tricks to try to get ahead. Now, just like self-imposed restrictions are not the same as self-discipline, here it is extremely important for us to recognize the difference between shrewdness. Tricks are not the same as creative solutions. That is spoken of, referenced in line 2 of this chapter. Creative solutions occur when you find a better way of doing something that can produce equal or better results. It's a more efficient way, a more intelligent way, a way that makes more sense. Clever tricks, shrewdness, shortcuts are ways of not doing the work and pretending as if you did. So one is positive, creativity, very positive. This kind of cleverness and shrewdness, very negative. So the results, the consequence is also negative. This is what Lao Tzu is trying to express. in line 11, more strange things occur. So these strange things are negative in nature, and this is because those clever tricks are often used to take advantage of people who are naive and gullible. We've definitely seen plenty of that, especially in recent years. And shrewdness, clever tricks are also often used to sabotage people who are not guarding against those tricks. Hence, very negative in nature and maybe perpetrate fraud. What I mean is to run a scam, a grift, to trick people, separate them from their money, which is, of course, taking advantage of the naive and gullible. So the more clever tricks there are, the more negativity, negative results you will see, just like people getting hurt, injured, harmed, killed by weapons. Here, people are harmed in a different way by the clever tricks. Hence, very negative. So let's continue on and hopefully wrap up the negative aspects that's been observed by Laozi. Line 12, the more laws are posted. Keep in mind that when we talk about the Tao, throughout this entire chapter and previous chapters as well, there's a strong preference for simplicity over complexity. When you have more laws that are passed, that are posted, that complexity will be increasing. That results in negative consequences as well. For instance, complex laws invariably have loopholes. It's almost a given. That's the way it's always been. Certainly, that's the way it's been in our legal system. And the more complex laws you have, the more likely it is that you will have laws that contradict one another. You've got something that is illegal according to one law, but legal according to another. And when you try to fix complexity with more complex solutions, you run into a problem. For instance, attempting to close the loopholes, resolve conflicts, may create additional new problems. We see that all the time. The more complex things are, the more you're likely to run into all of these. Really, the only solution is to simplify, simplify, simplify. Yet another negative consequence is line 13. The more robbers and thieves there are, the more laws are posted, the more criminals you end up with. So some may think that more laws will have a greater deterrence effect on criminal activities. This also doesn't pass the reality test. It may actually be quite the opposite. So we know that when the laws become very complex, they become more difficult to enforce. That's one aspect of it. In other aspects, we have, for instance, white-collar crime, where people who commit crimes already have figured out the law, so they commit those crimes that can evade the enforcement of the laws, because they have already understood the complexity and they're taking advantage of it. And one example that I'll use, US tax code spans more than 2,600 pages. Now, with that many laws in the books, you would think that it would deter criminals that take advantage of the tax code. Well, it really hasn't deterred anything. It hasn't reduced tax fraud. And we have also extremely wealthy individuals that have the ability to take advantage of the loopholes. They have accountants and tax lawyers to practice their craft. Now, set that aside for the moment. Let's talk about what really matters to us. This whole idea, applying this to life. Basically, what it says, what Lao Tzu is trying to express is that the more complexity you make your life, the more complexity you introduce into your life, the more you are likely to rob yourself of peace and joy. The opposite is just as true. The more you simplify, the better everything gets. So a little bit more about that in just a moment. Let's go on to some additional thoughts. So as I said, when we talk about life, the life that you and I live, the criminals, robbers and thieves represents you robbing yourself of peace and joy. Well, how can the criminals represent you? Well, remember, when we apply the Tao to the individual, you play every role. You are the king and the subject. You are the emperor and the citizen. And when you do something to your own detriment, you serve as your own criminals. The more complex you make your life, the more you take away the ability to enjoy. The more you try to use clever tricks to take shortcuts, the more you waste your time or run into dead ends. So as an example, and this is really the very polar opposite to self-discipline, to improve yourself in a particular way, shortcuts will be more like performance enhancement drugs. They are definitely a shortcut, and they always take a huge toll on the user of those drugs. So then let's explore the opposite side of it. The reverse is also true. The more you simplify, the better everything gets. More happiness, without a doubt, more joy, more energy, more fun, more peace of mind, better everything. So line 13 is the end of the section where Lao Tzu talks about what not to do. We now are in a position to summarize everything. And let's go ahead and do that. Again, we're going to use a chart to make sure that these concepts are things that we can easily grasp, easily visualize. Lao Tzu started out saying, if you look at the title of this slide, how do I know this is so? And then he says, with the following. So let's stick to the kingdom level for the time being, and then we'll circle back to the personal level. Restrictions. When there are many restrictions in the kingdom, the people suffer. The people become impoverished. You're keeping them from doing what they ought to be doing to be productive, to be happy. They are impoverished, and if the people are impoverished, the kingdom itself becomes impoverished. So that's one part. Then we have weapons. When people have a lot of weapons, Lao Tzu has observed, there's more chaos. The society becomes more chaotic. That's just the way it is. People get hurt, people get killed. And then in the kingdom, in society, people resort to more shrewdness and clever tricks. Strange things occur. By strange things, what Lao Tzu is saying is that you get all kinds of strange problems. You get fraud. You get people getting taken advantage of. You get people tricking others into doing certain things. So keep the yin and yang symbol in mind as we talk about all this. Everything here, including the fourth item to come, everything is what not to do. So that means later on, in the second half of the chapter, we're going to get to the other half of the yin and yang symbol, the what to do. But now though, let's wrap up the kingdom level. When you have more laws, you're not deterring criminal activity. You're actually giving rise to more criminal activities. And then we have to explore the personal level. How does Lao Tzu know that things go bad when we do certain things? Well, he has observed that when you place restrictions on yourself, your life is more impoverished. And this is where we recall back to mind the example, the interaction between the third and the fourth patriarch in the Zen Buddhism tradition. You seek the dharma of spiritual release. Well, are you getting tied up in ropes? No, nobody's tying me up. Then why do you need the dharma of spiritual release? Why do you need that when you already have the power within to take control and to see through the illusions of the material world? And then weapons. Do we weaponize our communication against other people? Can we set that aside? Rather than cutting remarks, critical remarks aimed at someone, suppose it's kind words instead, words of reconciliation. We can then hopefully turn things around from chaos to harmony. Clever tricks, shortcuts. If we take shortcuts in our lives, then we probably have all experienced having wasted valuable time. Coming back to the Tao. The more laws that are passed, the same idea that we have discussed, we become like the criminals in our own lives. We rob ourselves. We steal our own joy. We drain everything, all the goodness out of life. So the observation from Lao Tzu applies to the kingdom level and the personal level. And I hope that this mini summary here is a way to help you visualize how the process works. You're going to see this again in a different form in the summary we're about to go into. Yes, we're at the point where we need to visit the summary. We're just about done with the time that we have together today. The summary for today is a more conventional way of listing out the ideas provided by Lao Tzu. So here, the list is called 4 things to watch in life, meaning these are the things to watch out for. There's the self-limiting beliefs. We talked about how that can lead to an impoverished life. We also talked about how you have the ability, indeed the power, at any time to examine those self-imposed restrictions and then say, I actually don't need to accept that. They melt away. They disappear like the illusions that they are. Then we also talked about weapons against other people, what I called weaponized communication, bullying tactics, criticisms, verbal attacks. They are the things that create too much chaos. They are contrary to harmony. Therefore, it's another thing to watch out for. Then we have the category shrewdness and shortcuts. Yeah, well, cleverness seems like a good thing, but I gotta say, too much cleverness can work against us. As Lao Tzu pointed out, strange things occur, meaning they cause strange problems. And lastly, the last item, too many rules. At the national level, too many laws, regulations. At the personal level, these rules, complexity, rob you of peace and happiness. Instead, the recommendation, which we're going to talk about next time as well, is to use simple principles instead of complex rules. As you can see, there's a huge discussion waiting for us next time. The yin and yang symbol applies. We've talked about what not to do. Next time, we'll talk about what to do. I'm looking forward to that. Our meeting has come to an end, but the journey continues on. Let us all travel safely so we can meet again. Until next time, may the Tao fill you with peace and happiness.